Imagine a clear blue sky, silence, and suddenly the low, gut-wrenching roar of four engines tears through the air. A massive, dark machine passes over your head so low that you feel the vibration deep in your chest. This is not a movie. This is not a reenactment. This is a real Avro Lancaster, and it is alive. On this entire planet, only two such machines remain. Two planes out of more than 7,000 built, and both of them still take to the sky. But today, I'm not just telling you the story of an airplane. I'm telling the story of how an absolute failure became an absolute legend. Of a machine that was considered impossible. Of missions that seemed doomed to fail. And of one operation that most people have never even heard of. One that will change everything you thought you knew about this aircraft. Watch until the end, because the most unexpected part is coming. So, the Avro Lancaster. How legends are born, and how it all began. The year is 1936. The British Air Ministry looks to the future and sees a threat. Europe is changing. Tension is rising. And military strategists realize one thing. The country needs a heavy bomber. Powerful, reliable, long range. The Avro company gets the order, and they get to work. That's how the Avro Manchester was born. On paper, a revolution. In practice, a catastrophe. The two Rolls-Royce Vulture engines that were supposed to be the heart of the machine turned out to be its curse. They overheated. They failed mid-flight. They caught fire. Pilots would return to base on one engine, or not return at all. The plane's reputation crumbled faster than they could build it. The Royal Air Force was furious. The engineers were in a panic. The program was threatened with total cancellation. And that is when one man steps onto the stage. Roy Chadwick, the chief designer at Avro. Quiet, methodical. The kind of man who doesn't shout in meetings, but goes home and stays awake all night because the solution is already spinning in his head. He looked at the Manchester's blueprints for a long time, a very long time. And he didn't see a failure. He saw a foundation. The fuselage was good. The wing was good. The problem was only the engines. What if we remove the two unreliable engines and install four proven ones? It sounds simple, but it meant redoing almost everything. Lengthening the wings, recalculating the loads, redesigning the engine nacelles. In fact, creating a new airplane. Chadwick did it. He took that very wing of the Manchester, which critics considered too large and clumsy, and turned it into the main advantage of the new machine. A wingspan of 31 meters provided a lift that no competitor had. Under those wings went four Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, legendary, reliable, already proven on the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters. And here is what is most incredible. The first prototype of the new plane took to the air in January 1941. Test pilot Sam Brown landed and said simply, "This is a completely different machine." He was right. It was an absolutely different machine. The Avro Lancaster was born. But no one knew yet what it would turn out to be, what kind of load it could carry, what it would be capable of. That remained to be seen, and what was discovered surprised everyone, even Chadwick himself. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine a machine almost 21 meters long, a wingspan of 31 meters. That is wider than many city streets. 4 engines, 7 crew members, and a takeoff weight of over 30 tons. That is the Avro Lancaster in numbers. But numbers don't capture the essence. To understand this plane, you need to take it apart. Let's start with the heart. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Each developed over 1,100 horsepower. Together, they gave the machine a speed of up to 450 kilometers per hour at an altitude of about 5,500 meters. The sound of these 4 engines working in unison was so characteristic that British ground crews could identify a Lancaster by ear, in complete darkness, from many kilometers away. This was the voice of the machine. Low, powerful, slightly menacing. Now, the wings. Remember that wing critics thought was too big? That very wing became the Lancaster's secret weapon. Such a span provided exceptional lift. The plane could take off from an airfield, even in a condition where engineers from other countries would have tapped their heads, so overloaded was it. But the most brilliant part of the design is what you can't see from the outside: the bomb bay. Most heavy bombers of that time were designed for a specific standard munition. Everything was calculated in advance: size, weight, mounts. It's logical and convenient. But Chadwick did otherwise. He designed the bomb bay as a single continuous space nearly 8.5 meters long. No cross partitions, no internal structural beams. Why is this brilliant? Because such a bay could be adapted to anything. Standard bombs, certainly. Non-standard cargo of huge size, also certainly. It is this bay that, a few years later, would allow the Lancaster to carry what didn't fit into any other Allied aircraft. But more on that later. Now, let's go up to the cockpit. The pilot and co-pilot station was located in a glass-nosed section with a magnificent view. The dashboard, analog instruments, levers, switches. No automation in the modern sense. Every decision, by hand and by head. Altitude, course, speed, fuel, everything was tracked manually, in real time. The navigator worked at a special table: maps, a slide rule, a star sextant for night navigation. Imagine, night, 5,000 meters altitude, darkness outside, and a man calculating the course by the stars, like sailors centuries ago. The radio operator maintained contact with the base. The gunners, the mid-upper turret and the tail turret, monitored the airspace around the machine. The tail gunner was located in a separate glass cabin at the very end of the plane, isolated from the rest of the crew. This was the most vulnerable and the loneliest place on board. And finally, the bomb aimer. At the moment of reaching the target, it was he who took control. The pilot followed his commands. The entire flight, all the hours in the air, all for those few minutes when the bomb aimer looked through the sight and said, "Left, more left, hold it, drop." That is what an Avro Lancaster is from the inside. A machine where each of the 7 people was indispensable, where coordination meant everything, where one person's mistake meant trouble for all. The average age of the crew was 22. Think about that again. Young people who had barely grown up boarded this machine and climbed into the night sky again and again. And it is about them that our next chapter is written. Royal Air Force Base, somewhere in Lincolnshire. Early morning. 7 people gather at the plane. The mechanic has finished the pre-flight check. The engines are cold. The grass on the airfield is covered in dew. Dawn is just beginning over the horizon. They barely talk. Everyone knows their place. Everyone knows their task. This is an Avro Lancaster crew. Who are these people? Let's meet each of them, because understanding the machine is impossible without understanding those who brought it to life. The crew commander, the pilot, usually an officer. On his shoulders is the entire plane, all 7 lives, and the completion of the mission. He made split-second decisions. Evade an interceptor, down or to the side. Return on one engine, or stretch it to a reserve airfield. Every decision, without the right to make a mistake. The co-pilot or flight engineer monitored the engine condition, fuel consumption, oil temperature. While the commander held the yoke, the flight engineer kept the machine alive. He knew every sound, every vibration. If something changed in the hum of the engines, he felt it before the instruments. The navigator, perhaps the most intellectually demanding role on board. No satellite positioning, no electronic maps, only mathematics, a sextant, a map, and his own head. On a clear night, he navigated by the stars. In cloudy weather, by calculated time and wind speed. A mistake of a few degrees at the start of the route meant missing the target by tens of kilometers at the end. The radio operator was the crew's voice. He kept in touch with base, received weather reports, transmitted progress reports. In conditions of radio silence over enemy territory, he sat and listened, ready at any moment to go on the air or receive an urgent message. The bomb aimer. Throughout most of the flight, he assisted the navigator and observed the situation. But at the moment of reaching the target, everything changed. He would lie down at the site, and the crew commander literally handed over control of the plane to him. 2 degrees left. Hold steady. A little more. Drop. These few minutes were the purpose of the entire flight. And finally, the gunners. Upper and tail. They were the crew's eyes and defense. The tail gunner was stationed in a glass turret at the very end of the fuselage, alone, cut off from the rest, with machine guns and an endless dark sky in front of him. Many of them were very young people. Pilots, navigators, gunners arrived from all corners of the British Commonwealth, from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. They spoke the same language, but grew up in different worlds. A farmer's son from Ontario, a student from Melbourne, a teacher from Yorkshire, a mechanic from Auckland. They became a crew. Do you know how veterans described this bond many years later? They said that a Lancaster crew is something between a family and a team. You trusted these people absolutely, not because you chose them, but because there was no other choice. On the ground, they ate together, relaxed together, joked and sat in silence together, and then, together, they boarded the plane and disappeared into the night. And every crew had its own story. Some crews flew 30 sorties or more. That was considered a full tour of duty. Others didn't return after the first. The statistics were cold and ruthless. But people tried not to think about that. They thought about the next flight, about the weather, about whether the engines would hold up, and about the mission. And it was the mission that determined everything. Route, altitude, time in the air, level of risk. Most missions were nocturnal. Darkness offered some protection. Crews left at sunset and returned at dawn, if they returned. But among all the assignments the Lancaster crews received, there was one special. So insane in its concept, so incredible in its execution, that even today, decades later, historians call it one of the most daring operations in aviation history. And to carry it out, something completely special was needed. Not just pilot skill, not just the machine's reliability. It required an invention that, until that moment, did not exist in nature. Spring 1943. Somewhere in a quiet office of the British government, one man spreads out blueprints and photographs on the table. His name is Barnes Wallis, an engineer, an inventor. A man whom his colleagues considered a bit strange, because he thought about things others didn't dare to even contemplate. In the photos, 3 huge dams in the Ruhr Valley, Mona, Eder, Sorpa. Wallis looks at them and sees not concrete, he sees vulnerability. The dams were practically invulnerable to conventional bombs. A direct hit from above, the concrete absorbed the impact. Torpedoes, anti-torpedo nets reliably protected the foundation. Military engineers on both sides agreed on one thing. Destroying these dams from the air is impossible. Wallis thought otherwise. He spent months calculating, hundreds of experiments. He threw marbles into a bathtub, studied the propagation of shock waves in liquid, and came to a conclusion that sounded like madness. If a special cylindrical munition were dropped from a precisely calculated height, at a precisely calculated speed, with backspin, it would skip across the surface of the water, like a flat stone with which children skip across a pond. It would reach the base of the dam, slide down the wall underwater, and explode at the point of maximum structural vulnerability, the bouncing bomb. Military command initially looked at Wallis with unconcealed skepticism. Too complex, too many variables, too little time. But the calculations were flawless, and eventually, permission was granted. Now, pilots were needed. Specifically for this operation, a new unit was formed, the 617th Squadron of the Royal Air Force. Commander, a 24-year-old officer named Guy Gibson. Young, experienced, absolutely cool-headed. Pilots were selected personally, the best of the best. Those who had hundreds of hours of flight time on Lancasters. Those who knew how to hold the machine with precision to the meter. Because precision here was literally a matter of mission success. Listen carefully. For the bouncing bomb to work, the pilot had to maintain three conditions simultaneously. Speed, exactly 350 kilometers per hour. Distance to the dam, exactly 422 meters at the moment of drop. And altitude above the water, exactly 18 meters. 18 meters. That's roughly the height of a 5-story residential building, over the water, at a speed of nearly 350 kilometers per hour, at night. How can you even maintain such an altitude in the dark? Wallis invented that too. 2 spotlights were installed on each Lancaster, one under the nose, one under the tail, at a specific angle. When both light spots converged on the water's surface into one point, it meant exactly 18 meters. Primitive, brilliant, flawless. To measure the distance to the dam, the bomb aimer used a wooden triangular sight with 2 nails on the ends. When the dam's towers aligned with the nails, the distance was right. Drop. Training lasted several weeks. Pilots repeatedly made runs at low altitude over British reservoirs. At night, over dark water. Again and again. Then came the night of the 16th to the 17th of May, 1943. 19 Lancasters took to the air. 3 groups. Different routes. Total radio silence over enemy territory. They flew at extremely low altitude to deceive radars. Trees flashed under the wings. Power lines were a real danger. One plane clipped an antenna and barely maintained control. The first attack on the Manna Dam. Gibson went in first. Spotlights. 18 meters. Speed held. The bomb released. It skipped across the water. 1, 2, 3, and reached the dam. The explosion shook the air, but the dam held. Run after run, plane after plane. Some hit, some didn't. Anti-aircraft artillery opened fire. The sky over the reservoir became dangerous. And suddenly, the radio came alive. A code signal passed through the airwaves. Manna Dam breached. Gibson immediately led the remaining planes to the Eater Dam. There, history repeated itself. Run after run, explosion after explosion. And again, a code signal on the air. Eater Dam breached. Out of the 19 Lancasters that left for the mission, 11 returned to base. 8 machines did not return. Gibson landed the plane, stepped onto the airfield, stood in silence. Operation Chastise went down in history as one of the most daring and technically complex aviation raids of all time. The bouncing bomb worked. The Lancaster succeeded. But the history of this aircraft didn't end there, because ahead lay a target that was considered absolutely invulnerable. A target for whose defeat the Lancaster needed something even more incredible than the bouncing bomb. A steel giant was waiting, and its time was coming. Imagine a ship. Not just a ship, a fortress. A floating steel fortress 251 meters long. That's roughly 2.5 football fields placed in a row. Displacement, nearly 53,000 tons in combat trim. Armor of the hull in the most protected places, 320 millimeters of steel. For comparison, this is thicker than many walls of medieval castles built of stone for centuries. This was the German battleship Tirpitz, and it was a true nightmare for the British fleet. You can understand why this ship inspired such fear only if you understand its role. The Tirpitz almost never engaged in open combat. It simply existed. It stood in the Norwegian fjords, first in Trondheimsfjord, then in Altafjord, in the far north of Norway. And by its very existence, it tied down huge forces of the British fleet. The British Admiralty could not afford to ignore the Tirpitz. As long as this ship was alive, convoy routes in the North Atlantic could not be weakened. Battleships could not be redeployed to other theaters of war. One ship, standing in a fjord, kept an entire fleet on edge. It was called the Lonely Queen of the North, a beautiful nickname for a very dangerous problem. The British tried everything: submarines, The fjords were too well guarded. Surface ships, suicide in narrow passages among cliffs. Conventional air raids, the armor withstood everything thrown at it. In 1942, Royal Air Force planes made several raids on the Tirpitz. Bombs fell. Some hit. The ship sustained damage and continued to exist. Standard aviation bombs simply could not pierce such armor. And again, Barnes Wallis. This man, it seems, was created specifically to solve problems that everyone else considered unsolvable. After the success of the bouncing bomb, he was already working on the next idea. And this idea was so massive that the military initially reacted to it with the same skepticism as the bouncing bomb. Wallis reasoned as follows. If a conventional bomb cannot pierce armor from above, then you don't need a conventional bomb. You need a bomb that doesn't just fall on a target. You need a bomb that reaches a speed at which armor ceases to be an obstacle. Physics was simple. The greater the projectile's mass and the higher the speed of its fall, the greater the kinetic energy of the impact. If you make a bomb heavy enough and drop it from a sufficient altitude, it won't just hit the armor, it will pierce it through. Or it will go into the ground next to the target and explode beneath it, creating a seismic shock from which no armor would save. Wallis calculated the parameters, then calculated again, then asked colleagues to check the calculations. The result was the same every time. The bomb must weigh 5 tons, 400 kilograms. That is the tall boy. Drop altitude, at least 5,000 meters. Only then would it gain enough speed to pierce armor or create an underground explosion of the necessary power. 5 tons, 400 kilograms. To understand the scale, that's more than a modern premium SUV weighs. This is a load that an ordinary truck carries with tension. And this load had to be lifted to an altitude of 5,000 meters and delivered to a target thousands of kilometers away. No Allied bomber could carry such a bomb. None, except the Lancaster. Remember that bomb bay without cross partitions that Roy Chadwick designed a few years ago? That's why it was needed. Only a continuous space 8.5 meters long could accommodate the tall boy. Only the lift of a 30-meter wing could lift the machine with such a load. Chadwick didn't know about Wallis's plans when he designed that bay, but his decision turned out to be prophetic. Lancasters of the 617th Squadron began receiving the tall boy in 1944, but before using them against the Tirpitz, they were tested on other targets: railway tunnels, fortified bunkers, underground factories. The results were stunning. The tall boy went into the ground for tens of meters and exploded there, creating an underground tremor that collapsed structures that seemed absolutely secure. Engineers called this effect an earthquake. That's what they called it, an earthquake bomb. Now, Tirpitz. In the autumn of 1944, British intelligence established the exact location of the battleship, Altafjord, the far north of Norway. The distance from British bases was huge, so huge that flying there and returning was practically at the limit of the Lancaster's capabilities. Practically, but not quite. Engineers conducted thorough calculations. To increase flight range, part of the equipment was removed from the planes. The crew was reduced. Additional fuel tanks were installed, and the side turrets were removed, the very ones that protected the machine from fighters. Think about this. Pilots were flying to one of the most protected targets in Northern Europe, in planes from which the defensive armament had been removed, because otherwise, the target was simply unreachable. The first attack took place in September 1944. 27 Lancasters took off from a Soviet airfield in Yagodnik. The crews flew to the Soviet Union specifically for this operation to shorten the distance to the target. Cloud cover over the fjord hid the ship. There were few hits. Tirpitz sustained damage, but remained afloat. The second attack, October 1944. Clouds again. Again, incomplete success. The Germans realized the Lancasters would not retreat. The Tirpitz was moved further south, to Tromsøfjord. Perhaps the German command calculated that the distance would now make new attacks impossible. They miscalculated. November 12, 1944. 32 Lancasters of the 617th and 9th Squadrons took to the air from the Scottish airfield Lossiemouth. On board each, a tall boy. In the tanks, just enough fuel to reach the target and return. Almost no reserve. This time, the sky over Tromsø Fjord was clear. The pilot saw the Tirpitz from afar, a huge gray silhouette against the dark water of the fjord. Anti-aircraft artillery opened fire immediately. The sky around the Lancasters was covered with black bursts of shells. But the crews held course. Bomb aimers pressed against their sights. Navigators counted seconds. Crew commanders held the machines in strict level flight, not a degree of deviation, despite the anti-aircraft fire. Drop. 32 bombs went down, dark silhouettes against the gray sky. Each, 5 tons, 400 kilograms of kinetic energy gaining speed and freefall. 3 direct hits, several near misses at the board. The Tirpitz tilted, then tilted further, then capsized. One of the largest battleships ever built in Europe lay at the bottom of the fjord. At base, the crews exited the planes and stood in silence for a long time. Photos taken by a reconnaissance plane a few hours later confirmed everything. A huge hull, turned upside down, barely protruding above the water. The lonely Queen of the North no longer existed. Barnes Wallis, having received the message about the raid's results, took off his glasses, wiped them, and looked out the window for a long time. What he was thinking at that moment, no one knew. But those who were nearby said that he didn't look triumphant. He looked devastated. Like a man who did what he had to do. The Lancaster succeeded again, where no one else could. But the most unexpected chapter in the history of this plane was still ahead, and it had nothing to do with dams or battleships. It was related to something much simpler and much more human. It was related to food. Winter 1944 to 1945, the Netherlands. Imagine a city that is slowly dying of hunger. Not metaphorically, literally. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague. Cities with a centuries-old history, with beautiful canals, with houses of red brick reflecting in the water. Cities where just a few years ago, elegantly dressed people walked the streets. Cafes were open, and shop windows were filled with fresh rolls. Now the windows were empty. Cafes closed. Streets quiet. People burned furniture to stay warm, cut down trees in parks, dismantled the wooden parts of houses. The daily ration for many residents by the beginning of 1945 was less than 500 calories. To understand, that's about one small bowl of thin soup a day. Adult men lost 20 to 30 kilograms of weight. Elderly people and children were in critical condition. Historians would call these months the Hunger Winter. In Dutch, Hungerwinter. This was a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the heart of Western Europe, while the whole world watched military operations on the front lines. British command knew what was happening. The Red Cross reported it. Neutral observers reported it. The numbers were frightening. By various estimates, millions of people suffered from the consequences of famine in the Netherlands that winter. But how to help? The front line ran right through the country. The land corridor for food delivery was blocked. The sea route, mined and under fire. Only one option remained: the air. The idea seemed insane for the same reasons as many other ideas that later turned out to be brilliant. German anti-aircraft batteries in the Netherlands were still active. A plane flying low and slow with a cargo on board was an ideal target. Negotiations were needed, and they took place. Through neutral intermediaries, British command contacted the German garrison in the occupied Netherlands. The proposal was simple. We will deliver food to the civilian population. Our planes will fly along agreed routes at low altitude without armament. We will not attack your positions. You will not fire on our planes. The German command agreed. It was something incredible even by the standards of that era. Two enemies, still fighting each other on other fronts, concluded a local ceasefire to save civilians. The operation was named Manna, after the biblical manna from heaven, the food that, according to sacred texts, God sent from heaven to a starving people. The name was not chosen by accident. Late April 1945, April 29th. The first Lancasters took to the air from British airfields and set course for the Netherlands. But these were not the Lancasters that for months had carried heavy bombs to hardened targets. Inside the bomb bays, where recently tall boys and other munitions lay, were now sacks of flour, boxes of canned goods, packages of powdered milk, chocolate, egg powder, margarine. The mechanics who loaded the planes said later that this was the strangest work they had ever done in their service. They were used to working with munitions. Now they were loading food. The Lancasters flew at an altitude of about 100 meters, incredibly low for such machines. Pilots saw the city streets, saw the rooftops, saw people running out of their houses and looking up. And here is where what happened took the breath away from even the most seasoned pilots. People waved their hands, ran out into the streets in whole families. Children ran to the fields where the cargo was dropped, even before the containers touched the ground. Women unfurled sheets with handwritten words of gratitude, huge letters visible from the air. One pilot recalled many years later. He said that in all his time of service, through all combat sorties, through all targets, through all routes, nothing shook him as much as this moment, when he led a huge bomber over a Dutch city, and below, as far as the eye could see, people stood and looked up, and waved and wept. He himself almost wept in the cockpit. Some crews violated strict orders and threw personal stashes of chocolate and cigarettes out of the portholes, the little they had themselves. Command turned a blind eye. On the ground, scenes unfolded that eyewitnesses described identically, regardless of which city they were in. People who just weeks ago could barely walk ran to the drop sites. Old men whom relatives carried out of houses in their arms so they could see the planes. Children who picked up spilled crackers from the ground and ate them greedily, right there in the field, not waiting until they got home. Dutch children wrote on the fields in huge letters, visible from flight altitude, "Thank you," in English, specifically for the pilots. During a few days of Operation Manna, British Lancasters flew more than 3,000 sorties. American planes joined the operation under their own code name, Operation Chowhound. In total, over 11,000 tons of food were dropped over the occupied Netherlands. 11,000 tons. That's not just a number. It's millions of servings of food. It's lives, concrete, real human lives that were saved thanks to the fact that huge combat machines, for a few days, became something completely different. They became breadwinners. Operation Manna continued until May 8, 1945, until the very last day of combat in Europe. And when the official announcement of capitulation sounded on May 8th, the last Lancasters over the Netherlands made a farewell circle over the cities before setting course for home. People below came out into the streets again, looked up again, waved again. But now it was not despair and not the gratitude of the starving. It was the joy of free people. Among those Dutch children who saw Lancasters in the sky over their cities in April and May 1945, there are people who are still alive today. They are now over 80 years old, and many of them say the same thing when asked about that time. They say, "I will never forget that sound. 4 engines over the rooftops. I heard it and understood that everything would be all right." That is the Avro Lancaster in full measure. Not just a machine carrying munitions to difficult targets. Not just a tool for performing the most complex technical tasks, but also a machine that once flew over dying cities and brought them life. This is, perhaps, the most human chapter in the entire history of this plane. But the story doesn't end there, because after the end of the war, a completely new fate awaited the Lancaster, and how this machine lived its post-war years is no less interesting than everything we have talked about so far. May 1945. Combat in Europe is over. On airfields across Britain stand Lancasters. Hundreds of machines. Thousands. They returned from their last sorties, were refueled, and technical personnel perform maintenance, out of habit, out of the inertia of years of service. And now they just stand, in rows, wing to wing, engines cold, cockpits empty. The confrontation is over, but what to do with the machines that were created for it? This was a question the military command asked itself regarding thousands of pieces of equipment. Tanks, trucks, ships, planes. All this needed to be either preserved, reoriented, or scrapped. The British post-war economy was exhausted. Maintaining a huge fleet of heavy bombers in peacetime was simply impossible. And yet, the Lancaster didn't leave immediately. It turned out to be too good a machine to abandon immediately. First of all, humanitarian missions continued. After Operation Manna over the Netherlands, Lancasters participated in Operation Exodus, returning prisoners of war from camps across Europe to their homeland. The huge bomb bays that had recently carried munitions were now equipped with simple seats. Exhausted, emaciated people would climb inside, and in a few hours find themselves at home. One of the veterans who survived captivity told this many years later. He said that when the Lancaster landed on the British airfield and the hatch opened, he saw green grass. Just green grass of an English field, and realized it was the end. That he had returned. Then experiments with civilian use began. The airline Trans-Canada Airlines and the British Overseas Airways Corporation, civilian air carriers, looked at the Lancaster with interest. A machine with huge flight range, 4 reliable engines, and proven endurance was an attractive foundation for a passenger plane. The Avro company created a civilian version, the Avro Lancastrian. The Lancaster fuselage was reworked. Combat equipment was removed. A passenger cabin was installed. The nose and tail sections were glazed. The result was a narrow, slightly ascetic airliner, not the most comfortable by civilian aviation standards, but fast and reliable. Lancastrians flew routes from London to Australia, London to Buenos Aires, London to Johannesburg. These were long flights with multiple stops, lasting several days. But the very fact that a combat bomber turned into a civilian airliner speaks to how universal and reliable Chadwick's original design was. In parallel, another version was developing, the Avro Lancastrian for meteorological observations. The converted machines would climb to high altitudes and collect data on atmospheric conditions. Quiet, inconspicuous service. No glory. Only flights, instruments, and data. But the longest post-war career of the Lancaster unfolded where it was least expected. In Canada. The Royal Canadian Air Force received Lancasters during the war years and actively used them as part of Bomber Command. After the end of combat, the Canadians decided not to rush to abandon the proven machine, and found an application for it that no one thought of when designing this plane: the Arctic. Canada is a country with the longest coastline in the world. Its northern territories stretch for thousands of kilometers in completely uninhabited areas. Patrolling these huge spaces, searching for distressed ships and planes, conducting ice reconnaissance, mapping unexplored areas. For all this, a plane with long flight range, reliable engines, and the ability to operate in extreme conditions was needed. The Lancaster was ideal. Canadian Lancasters, in the Avro Lancaster Mark X modification, served in Arctic conditions that seemed unthinkable. Temperatures as low as 50 degrees below zero, icing, endless darkness of the polar night, piercing winds, not a single airfield for hundreds of kilometers. Technical personnel worked outdoors, in the freezing cold, with tools that froze to the metal. Engines were preheated for hours before starting. Hydraulic systems required special winter oils. And yet, the machine flew. Canadian crews said that the Lancaster, in Arctic conditions, showed itself from an unexpected side. Yes, it required careful maintenance. Yes, the cold created additional difficulties. But when the engine started and the machine took to the air, it was reliable, predictable, understandable. Pilots said, "You know what to expect from it." And in the Arctic, that is most important. The Royal Canadian Air Force operated Lancasters until 1964. Think about this figure. A design developed in the late 30s was taking to the sky 25 years after its appearance, in conditions for which it was not originally intended at all. This speaks to the quality of Roy Chadwick's engineering solution more eloquently than any words. In Britain, the post-war fate of the Lancasters unfolded differently. The Royal Air Force was gradually transitioning to jet technology. The jet era was arriving rapidly. Lancasters, one after another, were retired from service. Some machines were scrapped for metal, a harsh but economically understandable fate for military equipment in an exhausted post-war country. Some were handed over to museums. Several planes were preserved as monuments at airfields and bases. And only a few, literally a few out of more than 7,000 built, survived all these decades in a condition suitable for restoration. Do you know what is the saddest part of this part of the story? The Lancaster did not leave the stage with fanfare. There were no grand farewell ceremonies. There were no special final flights with an honorary escort. The machine simply taxied to the parking lot for the last time and stayed there. Mechanics who had maintained these planes for years remembered it differently. Someone said there was relief, the hard work was over. Someone said there was a strange feeling when looking at a plane you know, like your own fingers, and realizing it will never fly again. One mechanic from the 617th Squadron wrote in his memoirs very simply. He wrote, "I put the tools in the box, closed the lid, and went home. I never approached that plane again." But the history of the Lancaster did not end there, because several machines did survive. They went through the decades, lived through the change of eras, the change of technologies, the change of generations. And not just survived, they were restored to a state where they can fly. 2 planes on the entire planet, and both of them still take to the sky. Here are those 2 machines, about how they survived and what they mean today, our next chapter, on the entire planet Earth. On the entire planet, with its 8 billion inhabitants, with its thousands of airfields, with its hundreds of aviation museums, there is exactly 2 Avro Lancasters capable of taking to the air. 2 out of more than 7,000 built. Let's meet each of them, because each has its own story, and both of these stories are worth telling. The first lives in Canada. Its tail number, FM213. It belongs to the Canadian Air and Space Museum, located in Ottawa. This plane went through a path that could be called a happy coincidence, if not for the fact that behind every such coincidence stood specific people who made specific decisions. Lancaster FM213 was built in 1945 at the Victory Aircraft Plant in Canada. It appeared literally at the very end of hostilities and did not participate in real combat sorties. After the end of the war, it went into service with the Royal Canadian Air Force and was used for the very Arctic reconnaissance we talked about in the previous chapter. Years passed. Jet aviation was pushing out piston machines. In 1964, when Canadian Lancasters were finally retired, FM213 turned out to be among those who were lucky. It was not sent to the scrap heap. It was handed over to a museum. But museum storage is not the same as flight status. For many years, the plane stood in a hangar. It was maintained, kept in good condition, but it did not take to the air. And then the restoration began. Canadian enthusiasts and museum specialists took on work that many considered impossible. Restoring a 70-year-old plane to full flight condition is not just a repair. It is archaeology. It is detective work. It is the search for parts that have long been out of production all over the world. It is the study of original blueprints, technical manuals, veterans' memories. Some parts were found in other planes of the same type that stood in museums. Some were manufactured from scratch, according to original blueprints. Some were found in private collections by people who had kept spare parts for decades without knowing why. The work took years. When it was finished, and FM213 started all 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for the first time after years of silence, mechanics standing nearby said the sound was deafening. Not in terms of volume, in terms of how it hit the bones. This low, gut-wrenching roar of 4 engines that people remembered from the 40s, it returned. Today, the Canadian Lancaster regularly flies at air shows. It performs together with other historically significant aircraft from the museum's collection: the Spitfire, the Hurricane. When it passes over the spectators at low altitude, those who stand on the ground crane their necks and fall silent. But there is a second one, and its history is special. The British Lancaster bears a proper name. It is called City of Lincoln, tail number PA-474. It belongs to the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight and is based at Coningsby Airfield in Lincolnshire, in the very heart of the part of England where dozens of Bomber Command airfields were located during the war years. This is not a random coincidence. This is a choice. PA-474 was built in 1945. Like its Canadian brother, it didn't manage to take part in combat sorties. After the end of the confrontation, the plane was used for various testing programs, then for photographic reconnaissance in Africa, then long years of ground storage. In 1964, when the plane was already about to be decommissioned for good, it was literally saved. The Royal Air Force made a decision to preserve PA-474 as a historical exhibit. The plane was handed over to the Cosford Aviation Museum, where it stood for several years. And then, the path to revival began. The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, an organization that deals with the preservation and operation of historical British combat aircraft, took on PA-474. Restoration took years of painstaking labor. Specialists, many of whom worked as volunteers, in their spare time, on weekends, during vacations, restored the plane piece by piece. In 1973, PA-474 took to the air for the first time after restoration. Since then, it flies every summer, every airshow season, every year at memorial events dedicated to the veterans of Bomber Command. And every time, the same thing. People fall silent when they hear the sound of its engines. Elderly men who are now over 90 look at it and weep, quietly, unashamedly. They hear this sound, and they remember. In 2014, something happened that aviation history fans call one of the most moving events in history. The Canadian Lancaster FM213 flew to the UK. For the first time in decades, two flying Lancasters were in the same sky. They flew together over the green fields of Lincolnshire. Over those very places from which, 70 years ago, hundreds of the same machines left for missions. Wing to wing. 4 engines to 4 engines. 8 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines sang in unison over English soil. Thousands of people gathered at Coningsby Airfield. Among them were veterans, those who still remembered these planes, not as museum exhibits, but as working machines on which they flew into the darkness and hoped to return at dawn. When the two Lancasters passed over the crowd, people wept, openly, unashamedly. Old men in berets with medal ribbons, their children, their grandchildren, who had never seen anything like it, and didn't really understand why their grandfather suddenly turned away and took out a handkerchief. One of the veterans, he was over 90 then, said to reporters after the flyby. He said very simply, "I hear them, and I am there again. 20 years old again, on the airfield again, and the boys, all of them alive again." He paused. It's good. It's very good that they still fly. Today, both Lancasters continue to fly. They are maintained by teams of dedicated specialists and volunteers, many of whom have devoted years of their lives to these machines. Parts for engines are searched for all over the world. Every flight requires many hours of technical preparation. Every season is a separate story of the struggle to keep the machine in the air. Why do they do it? One of the mechanics working with the British PA-474 answered this question this way. He said, "When this plane flies overhead, history ceases to be history. It becomes real. You don't read about what happened. You hear it. You feel it in your chest. And this cannot be replaced by any museum, any book, any documentary." He is right. There is something special about these two machines continuing to fly. Something that cannot be explained rationally, only felt. They connect us with people who are no longer here. With those young 22-year-old boys who boarded these planes and disappeared into the night sky. With the mechanics who followed them with their eyes and waited for dawn. As long as the Lancaster flies, these people are not quite gone. But there is one question that remained unanswered. A question that I want to ask you right now, before the final chapter of our history. What exactly makes a machine, not just an airplane, not just a technical device, but a legend? What turns metal, fabric, and oil into something that makes people weep 80 years later? About that in the finale. There is a question I asked you at the end of the previous chapter. What makes a machine a legend? Let's try to answer together. Let's take any other plane of that time. Technically perfect, reliable, released in a large series, having honestly done its job. There were thousands of such machines. Most of them you cannot name now. Not because they were bad, but because they were just airplanes. The Lancaster is not just an airplane, and it's not about the technical specifications, not about the number of sorties, not about records of range or payload. All this is important, but it doesn't explain the tears in the eyes of a 90-year-old veteran who looks at the sky and sees himself young again. A legend is born at the intersection of three things. The first is time. The Lancaster appeared at a turning point in history, when the outcome of a huge global confrontation was not yet decided, when every sortie mattered, when the stakes were absolute. Machines born in such a time carry the imprint of that time forever. The second is people. The Lancaster was not just a piece of metal. It was a home for a crew of 7, young people from all corners of the British Commonwealth who trusted each other absolutely, because there was no other choice. Each plane out of the 7,000 built carried within itself dozens of such stories, hundreds of people, each with their own name, with their life before, and hopes for a life after. When you look at a Lancaster, you are not looking at a plane. You are looking at all these stories at once. And the third is what I call the breadth of fate. Think about the path this plane took. It was born out of a catastrophe, out of the failure of its predecessor. It carried bouncing bombs over night reservoirs. It sank battleships with bombs weighing several tons. It flew over starving cities and dropped not munitions, but sacks of flour and chocolate. It patrolled Arctic darkness over the Canadian North, and it still flies over the green fields of Lincolnshire on summer evenings. No other plane of that generation has taken such a path. From destruction to creation. From combat sorties to humanitarian missions. From the past to the present. Roy Chadwick, when he designed this plane in the late 30s, was thinking about one thing. He wanted to create a reliable, powerful machine that would fulfill the assigned task. He was an engineer. He thought in categories of blueprints, loads, engine characteristics. He couldn't have known he was creating a legend. Barnes Wallis, inventing the bouncing bomb in a quiet office and dropping marbles into a bathtub, was thinking about physics and mathematics, about the laws of shockwave propagation in liquid. He didn't think that his invention and Chadwick's plane would together go down in history as one of the most daring technical feats of the 20th century. Guy Gibson, leading his Lancaster over the dark water of the Moan Reservoir at an altitude of 18 meters, was thinking about speed, about altitude, about a sight with 2 nails. He didn't think that this night would be described in thousands of books and become the subject for movies. The young mechanic from the 617th Squadron, who put the tools in the box and closed the lid for the last time, was thinking that he was tired, that he wanted to go home, that the confrontation had finally ended. He didn't think that in 80 years people would study every rivet of the machine he had maintained. That is what history is. People live it, not knowing they are making history. And that is exactly why the Lancaster is immortal. Not because it is the best plane in the world, not because it has the most beautiful lines or the most outstanding characteristics, but because in it is concentrated something more than an engineering solution. In it is concentrated time, people, decisions, fear, skill, losses, victories, and, unexpectedly for everyone, kindness. Those sacks of flour over the Netherlands. Those Dutch children who rode on the fields. Thank you. Today, when a British Lancaster named City of Lincoln taxis to the runway on a summer morning and starts 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, this sound is heard for several kilometers around. People come out of their houses. Farmers stop tractors. Children look at the sky. No one explains to them what is happening, but everyone understands. Something important is happening. The machine accelerates down the runway. 30 tons of metal, fuel, and history take to the air. The landing gear retracts, and there it is, in the sky. That very silhouette, those very wings with a span of 31 meters. That very gut-wrenching roar that was heard over Lincolnshire in the 40s. And the people standing below catch their breath. Not all of them, not everyone, but those who know the history necessarily. You have just learned this story. A plane born from failure. Crews of 7 young people who disappeared into the night sky. Bouncing bombs over reservoirs. 6-ton shells that sank steel giants. Sacks of food over starving cities. Arctic patrols. Years on the ground. And a revival. 2 planes on the entire planet, out of more than 7,000. 2, and they fly. Next time you see a photo of a Lancaster, or, if you are incredibly lucky, hear the live sound of its engines, remember all this. Remember Roy Chadwick with his blueprints. Remember Barnes Wallis with his marbles and bathtub. Remember the 22-year-old guys who boarded this machine and looked at the dawn sky, not knowing if they would see the next dawn. Remember the Dutch children who wrote on the fields the word of gratitude, in huge letters visible from flight altitude. Remember the veteran who said, "I hear them, and the boys are alive again." That is what the Avro Lancaster is. That is why this machine is not just an airplane. That is why its story deserves to be told. Again and again. To every new generation that has never heard this sound live. As long as we remember, they fly. 2 planes, thousands of stories, and a sky that remembers everything. Thanks for watching. See you soon.